So the obvious place to start when you start getting into astrology is to start looking at placements, right? So we start looking at planets, we start looking at signs, we start looking at houses, things like that. But then the next step, and for me where it starts to get really interesting, is when you start to look at how these different placements interact and what the dynamics of the different placements when put together is, and that's where you really start to be able to weave together the kind of narrative within a chart. And the way that we quantify the relationship between different planets and the way that we interpret those is through a system of what we call aspects. So this video in particular is about the sextile aspect. So without further ado, let's talk about sextiles. So how is it that we quantify when two planets are forming a sextile aspect or not? So what that really means is that it's measured by two planets that are 60 degrees separate on a chart or around the zodiac. So when 60 degrees, give or take, we tend to give a little bit of leeway either side with aspects. So I'm going to say 5 degrees either way. So if they are 55 or 65 degrees apart, I'd count that as a sextile. Why not? And when we consider that each sign is 30 degrees long, wide, it's 30 degrees. Then a sextile is two planets that are 2 signs apart, they're 2 signs round. And what's interesting about that is that that means that more often than not, these 2 planets that are in a sextile aspect, they're going to be linked by the fact that the 2 signs that they're in they share a polarity. Now what I mean by that is that we divide up all the signs in the zodiac in many different ways, and one of those is through polarity. And we say that every fire sign and every air sign is a masculine polarity, and every water sign and every earth sign is a feminine polarity. Feminine, you can call it active, passive, positive, negative, there's lots of different ways. And so because that skips every time, it means that if they're forming a sextile, then they're almost always, sometimes not because of the orb, but almost always they're going to be in a sign which shares a polarity. And for that reason, we consider the sextile to be a harmonious aspect. And what we really mean by a harmonious aspect is that it's basically a good thing. If you use astro.com to get your chart, then all the blue lines are the harmonious aspects, and all the red lines are the challenging aspects. So the blue lines are good, and sextile is definitely one of those things. So a sextile is definitely a harmonious aspect, but it does require a little bit of work in developing the positive aspects of that aspect. Unlike a trine is another harmonious aspect, something that comes really, really easily to you. It means that the relationship between these 2 planets really flows really well, and they just get on really well. Sextile, they get on well, but it's more like an opportunity than a talent. It's something that the door is open, but you still have to walk through it and put in a little bit of work. Where I think some of the difference here is marked between the trine and the sextile is that in a trine that they share an element, the 2 signs that are involved in a trine. Signs in a trine. But in a sextile, they are the same polarity, but they're different elements, right? So that basically means that it's less passive. There's a little bit of friction there, but a lot of the times when I talk about aspects with clients and so on, is that one thing I bring up is that the more often friction, not necessarily the more friction, but when there's friction in an aspect or an aspect pattern, it's often that friction which leads to people putting in the work to really get the best out of that aspect and themselves ultimately. And often with particular reference to a sextile, when we develop the relationship between 2 parts of ourselves, which are represented by 2 planets in our chart, because that's ultimately what a chart is, it's representative of you. So these 2 parts, that when we develop that relationship and when we get the progress and when we develop those positive attributes, because we had to work for them, it's like we can really value them. We value them more highly than some parts of ourselves that we feel just kind of fell in our lap, which would be represented by a trine. So I'll give an example here from my chart. This is my chart here. Lovely, isn't it? I've got a couple of sextiles. We can see down here, this is the table where we can see all the different aspects. So we look at the sextile symbol. There's one here, there's one here, there's one here, there's one here. A few. So we can see what I mentioned earlier. The blue lines are the harmonious aspect and the red ones are the challenging aspects. Okay, so I'm going to focus on one sextile in particular that is running between my Mars here, which is at 3 degrees in Sagittarius, and my Venus, which is at 5 degrees of Aquarius. So we can see here that they are 2 signs apart and that they're not exact. This is 3 degrees and 5 degrees, meaning that the difference here is 62 degrees and not exactly the 60 degrees, which it would be in an ideal world, but almost never in reality. So your Mars placement can show, for example, how you go about what it is that you want, and often your Venus placement can show your value system, as in what it is that you want, perhaps what it is that you need, and things that you value, your value system. And if this is a sextiles or harmonious thing, the thing is that for me, what I value and how I've been going about getting it has been quite inconsistent throughout my life. I've changed track in life many times, and through that I've had the opportunity to hone my own methods of like achieving goals and things like that, and that's something that I'm very proud of. First of all, that I've been able to get better at achieving things, and it also means that it gives me an extra reason to be proud of my achievements, as I've just implied about the sextile. It gives me extra reason to be proud of my achievements because I've had to work all that just a little bit harder even sometimes in order to achieve them. With the sextile, because it does imply that little bit of work, often sextile aspects can indicate that there's a little bit of they can perhaps be mentally energizing in the way that these two parts of yourself, these two planets, interact in your psyche. They can be natural catalysts in that way because, as I said, it's like an open door. It implies a bit of work that needs to be done, but it's much more carrot than it is stick, if you get my meaning. Sextiles are also quite explorative, right? They can represent like an eagerness for learning new experiences, right? Because in the way that you are, it gives you the desire to go out and seek new things, so it can be explorative in that sense. To compare it once more to the trine aspect, because a trine represents things that come really, really easily, and can even be a little bit kind of lazy just because how easy things come. And because then, conversely, a sextile implies a little bit of work. Sextile aspect, planets that are forming a sextile aspect, and relationships represented by a sextile aspect can be less inclined than a trine to apply themselves consistently and passively, right? Because, as I said, it needs a little. We've all got those friends, where it's just like a little bit of work, but the friendship is still, you still get a lot out of it and so on. But like, you just can't deal with them all the time. That kind of thing would be a kind of sextile vibe for sure. They're also more situation oriented than a trine, like similar with the friend thing. Maybe you want to spend time with them doing this thing, but not necessarily doing that thing. You know what I mean? So you can kind of like kick the positive aspects of yourself that you get through a sextile. Maybe you pick and choose when exactly you want to use them, really. So my final word on the sextile is that it's much more of a coaxing than it is like a push or a drive in order to develop something. We definitely consider them to be a minor aspect. So, I mean, it's not like at the end of your life when you're getting your score, it's not like the sextiles are like one of the main objectives. It's not like, well, you failed that life mission because you didn't maximize all your sextiles. That's not the vibe. But because what they represent can be something that's really useful, it's very much a very nice to have. And because it's so nice to have, I would advise you that to look at the sextiles in your chart and don't be afraid, and to kind of identify what areas of yourself and what areas of your life are implied in that aspect relationship. Don't be afraid of putting in the work to develop those parts of yourself. I really think that the rewards are always going to be there, and they're always going to be worth it, even if the journey doesn't seem like it when you begin. Alright, those are my thoughts on the sextile aspect. I hope that you found that video interesting and informative and perhaps even entertaining. If you did find it interesting, what did I say? I forget the second one, but entertaining. If you find it entertaining, you can let me know by hitting the like button below and the subscribe button below so that YouTube will let you know when I put up another one of these videos. Alright, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.